Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Ben Kinsley is joining us. Hello, Ben.
Hey, Pat, how are
How
you?
are you? Good. Normally, Ben and I co-host the show, but today we are turning the tables on Ben.
Yeah,
Ben
turning
is on the
tables.
board, exactly. Ben is on the board of directors of Campaign for Vermont with me and several others. And he's the secretary of the board and is our resident policy wonk. We probably should come up with another word other than wonk. But so I asked Ben to join us because we've got some interesting things afoot, which will be announced actually the day after we videotape this. So um, Ben, maybe we could talk before we talk about the report that we're focusing on tonight. You've worked on several areas within state government of interest, and I'd like you to just kind of talk about them a little bit and set the stage for what's coming up that we're announcing.
Sure. Yeah. It's been a while. I was just doing the math on this, and it's I've been involved in politics in Vermont in the state house for about a decade now, which is
Wow.
surprising to me, perhaps to others, and on a whole bunch of different policy issues, everything from education policy. I followed that for a long period of time. Economic policy, even a little bit of healthcare, a little bit of environmental protection stuff,
Right.
and also primarily ethics. So there, as a big part of the push that Campaign for Vermont made several years ago to get
That's
ethics
right.
laws passed in the state. That is a project that I've been working on for about 5 years, and so that was something I was really passionate about. I think Vermont was one of the few states in the country that did not have ethics laws for our public officials, and there's definitely reasons to have them in place, just to make sure people are accountable and that there's a process to follow if any questions do come up. So.
Right. Right. And I think on the environmental policies, the main focus, at least these days, is water quality. Correct? That's a big one for us. And
Well,
we're going
that's
to,
a big passion of mine as well, water quality. But it's also one of the things that I'm out on the lake enjoying our waterways almost every
yeah,
weekend during the summer,
yeah,
and that's something I really enjoy doing. And I think it's important. It's important to be able to enjoy those things and also to protect them. These are natural resources,
yep,
and I think that if you look at the array of things we can do from an environmental perspective in Vermont, the area that we can have the most impact, but put the least amount of effort, is protecting our waterways,
yep,
and I think this is an area that we really need to focus on,
yep.
as a state, and start making some progress.
Well, I honestly don't think people realize what an economic driver Lake Champlain is, and many of our other bodies of water around Vermont. It attracts a lot of people, and there's a lot of businesses that rely on that water being attractive to other
Well,
people.
and recreation. So they talk
Yeah,
about, kayaking, boating, fishing, swimming. There are significant periods of time in the summer where you can't swim in certain parts of the lake,
oh, right.
and that's a shame that we can't enjoy some of those natural resources that we do have, because we just haven't been good stewards of them.
Right, and shame on us, because that's not as many states have what we've got here all in one small package. So we better protect it.
Exactly.
Besides these reports and areas that you've been working on, we've also been monitoring some of the key legislative task force that have a meeting over this summer. Can you talk about those task force, at least that we're covering them, and hope to have out a report very soon before the legislature comes back?
Yeah, two significant areas three significant areas that we're following summer task forces on. First is the rebranding, and and people kind of get this wrong. It's not just rebranding; it's also reorganization
Right.
of the state colleges. Um, And this is really, really important because what we're really talking about here is the future workforce training infrastructure of our state. And it's not
Exactly.
just a name change. It's not just an administrative change. It's really, in a broader sense, taking a look at what programs do we have, where do we have them, what programs do we need, where are our gaps, where are our opportunities. And that is critically important for the future success of our state, which is going to depend on having a trained workforce that is able to carry out 21st century jobs. And that's
Exactly.
really important for the future of
Yeah.
our state. And people, not to say that people are only kind of getting surface level on that issue, but that is a really important perspective to have.
I've been answering a lot of Facebook comments about the rebranding. And it's just made me so not angry, but just frustrated that people don't get how important
It's
it
like
is
losing
to
the
have a one
forest.
solid brand.
It's losing the forest for the trees in the most
Exactly.
sense. It's like, yes, every school, every campus has a unique identity, and we need to protect those identities. But there's a lot more going on here than just the
Yeah,
name on the building.
I
And
know
that's,
exactly. I keep trying to explain that. I don't know if people are really paying attention. They should be watching the work that's being done.
yeah.
Anyway, so there's two other areas that we've been looking at.
Yeah. So student waiting, pupil waiting is another area that we have been following. Haven't really weighed in there too much. Really, we're just kind of watching the process unfold, but watching it very closely.
Yeah,
This is this is something that is critically important for the success of rural schools, and this basically looks at how we've done a whole show on this, but we can kind of point people there. But critically important for rural schools and for making sure that the right resources get to the right place. So very
that's
important
great.
issue there.
Very interesting topic. I know I said this on the show. There was when the Brigham decision was handed down, there was a memo written by a couple of the people from Ledge Council, which so explained pupil waiting. I honestly didn't understand it for
Yeah.
listening. I'm like, what are we doing? And that memo, and I should really congratulate the folks that wrote it, it just made it so clear how important it is to get this right and to get funding where it belongs to
Yeah.
the areas and the kids that really need it. So
Yeah, and there are tax rate implications for
yeah,
that as well. But really, what it comes down to is making sure that we get the right resources to the right place. And
yep,
is that going to mean that some communities are going to pay more and some are going to pay less? Yes, but the point is to make it as equitable as we can,
yeah,
because right now we can make a strong argument that it's not equitable. So
yeah. Well, it was really, I finally, when the light dawned, I was very excited that I understood this because it's hard to grasp what we're talking about. And the last one, of course, if I can jump in, is pension. And that leads us right into why we're really here tonight, is to talk about a report that Ben was instrumental with the help from a few other folks, instrumental in putting together, and it's going out, as I said, tomorrow, which is November 10th. Is that it, right? And you'll be reading a lot about this when you see this. See this show. You'll be saying, "What are they up to?" But Ben's going to explain it to it. Could you explain the title, which is about the public sector reality, and what the genesis of the report was? What's it all about?
sure. Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen here, so we can kind of talk through, because we got some slides that will help us
Yeah,
walk through what this topic is and why it's important. And what I would say, as a background information on this, we started putting this together over the summer, looking at the sorts of things that were being said in the task force. And really, we haven't put forward any specific proposals on exactly how benefits should be adjusted or how we should close the liability gap. Simply what we've said to this point is, whatever solution we put in place, we need to keep promises to existing retirees and people who are getting
Close
ready
to,
to retire. Yeah,
right.
close to retirement. We need to keep those people whole. We shouldn't be penalizing them. We maybe can play around with things like the COLA increases. Maybe those don't need to be 100% of CPI, but really we should be holding those people harmless. And then the second principle that we've kind of put out is that no one group should pay for all of this. Like this is a $4 billion liability that we're talking
Right.
about.
I've heard that number has gone, we've sort of settled in this report at 4.5 billion.
Yeah.
I thought it's kind of gone up in some reports, and 4.5 is staggering enough. So I'm comfortable with saying 4.5, but I thought I heard that it could go up $1 billion a year if we didn't do something.
Yeah, some calculations have it over 5 billion, some
Right.
have it closer to 4 billion. We've kind of settled for our purposes, we've settled somewhere in the middle. It really depends on what the markets are doing
Yeah.
currently. And they had a really bad year in 2020 and they've had a semi decent year in 21. That probably all averages out. So at a certain point in time. So we've kind of gone with the middle number
Yep.
In terms of projections. So we'll say it's like 4.5 billion is what our
Well, it's
current
staggering.
deficit is.
It's staggering alone, so I don't have a problem with it because I told you when I was at lunch and I heard it for the first time, I think a few other people in the restaurant heard my gasp because
Yeah.
I thought at first it was million. Then he goes, no, billion.
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 4.5 billion.
Billion. Yep.
And so really the principle that we laid out in the spring to the task force, and it's still the same thing that we're saying today, is that no one group should be responsible for that. That shouldn't be all on state employees. That shouldn't all be on teachers. It shouldn't all be on taxpayers either.
Right. Let's throw that in.
So everyone needs to, no one group was responsible for creating this problem, unless you feel like pointing fingers at the legislature.
No, but may I just interrupt a minute? That goes across party lines too. This has been going on. This isn't Democrat, Republican, progressive. It's all of us all together.
It's everybody.
We did this as a group. Yeah.
It's been across 4 or 5 different administrations.
Right.
Yeah, it's an everybody contributed to this problem.
Yep.
And so everyone needs to share in the solution. And so what this report was looking at specifically is that there's this perception, I've had it, and Pat, I know you've had it, that our public employees, our state employees and our teachers are underpaid, and that is what necessitates these exorbitant or very generous, at the very least, very generous pension plans and benefit plans. You look at healthcare, retirement, vacation plans, like all of that stuff. We have a very generous benefits package for our state employees and our teachers. And that historically, we've been told, is necessitated because their salaries are lower. And so we decided to, and those same claims have been made even as recently as 5 or 6 weeks ago.
Right.
And so we decided to look at that and say, hey, how do state employees and teachers' benefits compare to the private sector, and how do their wages compare to the private sector? And we didn't set out to make this a report necessarily. We set out to kind of answer this for ourselves because we were curious, and we discovered a whole lot of stuff along the way, and that's what turned into this report, and that's what we're going to be sharing with you guys today.
Yeah, and I don't think this highlights in the report itself, but I remember when I was one of those exempt employees, I had a few of those jobs, that those level jobs were proven by the Business Roundtable, actually, in a report they did, that those exempt positions, so the leadership positions, if you will, they were lower than in the private sector because they issued reports out. So I think people just assumed that position trickled on down, but as you will point out, over the years, that's changed a lot.
Yeah. So let's dive into that. Let's take a look and see what might be going on there. So this chart is looking at nationally. This is data that's available from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is looking at wages and benefits for all employees nationally, and then full-time just private industry workers, and then also state employees and local employees that are working for either state government or local government. And what we find here is that obviously, no surprise, there's a huge disparity in benefits. When you look at benefits on an hourly wage basis, you can see, $13 an hour in just benefits for state and local workers compared to just over $4 an hour in benefits for private industry workers. So there's a big gap there. That's sort of expected, just given the anecdotal knowledge that most people have about the benefits package for public employees. But where it starts getting interesting is not only are benefits more generous for state and local workers, but also wages are also more generous. You look at the average state and local employee makes $33 an hour, and that's compared to just under $26 an hour for a worker on average in private industry. Again, these are national numbers, but they do translate pretty well to Vermont. Somehow Vermont happens to be sort of around the national average for a lot of these, so it does translate somewhat. And then, of course, total compensation, when you look at that, is quite a bit more dramatic, where you have, if you calculate both wages and benefits, the average private sector employee is making a little under $37 an hour compared to a little under $54 an hour for a state and local employee. So total compensation is quite a bit more generous when you start looking at it that way. But the really surprising thing is that not only are when you just look at wages, forget about the salary and benefits, just looking at wages, public sector employees are actually out competing. They're more competitive on wages than the private sector on average. And one of the things, Pat, you kind of alluded to that you don't necessarily see in averages is the span. So the starting salary for state employees is going to be higher than the starting salary for private industry. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for the upper, top 10% as well. The people that are highest paid in state government are going to make less than the highest paid people in the private sector. So what you end up getting is you end up getting a more compressed range for public sector employees, and this is largely because they have bargained rates, right? They have salaries that are bargained. They have a narrower salary band. The public sector, you got people that are making $12, $13 an hour, and then you have people making $300 an hour. You just have a larger range in the private sector. So what we're comparing here are averages. Like, what is the average worker, if they're working for a public company versus working for a state or local government. The next thing that we see here, we start looking at some specific occupations. So teacher salaries. So if we start looking at teacher salaries, we find Vermont teacher salaries actually are pretty much on average with the national average. So about $61,000 to $62,000 a year is the average Vermont teacher salary. This is the top 16 in the country, right around the national average. You can see some states like New York and California pay quite a bit more than that. But other states that are a similar size, like Hawaii, Wyoming, Minnesota, actually pay less than we do. And even some, what I would call local competitors, like New Hampshire, we actually pay more than New Hampshire as well. Again, these are just looking at wages. Salaries are not part of this calculation. But
Ben, can I just, when you said you're looking at wages but not salaries.
Wages, not benefits. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, because I was like, missed something. Okay, benefits. Yeah, it's important to keep that distinction.
Right, because what we're trying to do is the question we're trying to answer is how competitive are
Right.
our public employees when we're just looking at wages. Forget the benefits piece of it, because what we're trying to see is like how big of a piece of the puzzle is the benefits package when we're trying to recruit and retain state and local, public employees.
Yeah. How far back did we go in this analysis? I'm trying to remember. 10 years?
We went all the way back to 1990, which
Oh,
is
really?
30 years. That's as far back as the Bureau of Labor Statistics
Oh.
and the Department of Labor data goes.
I'm assuming sometime or other, it must have been true that the ratio was tipped over to private.
We will get to that, because
Okay.
that was one of the questions that we had when researching this, is like, well, this must have been true at some point.
Yeah.
So we will get to that question.
Okay. Thanks.
The only other thing that really is worth noting here is that Vermont student teacher ratios are the lowest in the country. So we have about 10.5 students per teacher, which is the lowest student teacher ratio in the country. So even though we're middle of the pack in terms of salary, we have the most favorable student teacher ratio in the country. And then you look at a state like Utah, for example, who's at 23-1. And a lot of these other states like California, New York, Massachusetts, actually California is at 23-1, and they pay their teachers more, even though their student teacher ratio is less favorable. So if it's sort of not a great proxy, but if you want to consider, the number of students per teacher as sort of your workload, quote unquote, per workload, Vermont is probably one of the highest paid in the country, because our student teacher ratio is less than half of what California is, and California is maybe 20-25% higher salaries. So those are kind of some things to point out there, that there are some other factors we may want to think about. Even though we're at the national average for salaries, we're well below the national average for a number of teachers per student, or number of students per teacher. The other thing here that is interesting, this is kind of the tell-all. So now we're looking at how do these things all stack up. That's the next slide. So this one is showing, even though the average teacher in Vermont makes right around $60,000 a year, there is quite a distribution. So you have, the highest paid districts in the state, South Burlington, at an average of $78,000 per teacher. And then you have some districts in central and southern Vermont that are closer to $50,000 per an average salary of $50,000 a year. So there is quite a range here, and that's important to note that this is, again, whenever we're talking about averages, there's always more of a story behind that average. Right. Of this is not everybody is making this wage, right? There are going to be a certain number of people below, and there's going to be a certain number of people above, and this just kind of reiterates that point. So,
and I'm sure a lot of it is bargaining based on cost of living. I mean, obviously Burlington is a little more expensive to live in than Berlin, where I live. So that's got to account for something.
And so this kind of gets also to the point of like, there's that there's this teacher in the Northeast Kingdom is making $40,000 a year and can't afford rent, and and that story is probably true, because it's a law of averages. There is, with a law of averages, there's going to be someone in that situation, and it's not to say that they don't that they don't deserve more. We would love to pay teachers more. I would love to pay teachers
for sure
more. But when we're talking about what we can afford and what we can offer for benefits, we kind of need to compare averages, because we need to look at what's the most likely scenario for someone who's a teacher, and what's the most likely scenario for someone who's a state employee or is in the private sector, and how do those things compare to each other on average. And that's not going to be everyone's experience, but that's the really the only way we can compare it. So next, this is where it all starts coming together. So when you look at this, clearly, this is all Vermont data, so we're not looking nationally anymore. And what we're seeing is average private sector wages in Vermont, 48,400. And then we have the median. The median is going to be lower than the average, again, because there's a dispersion where, there's a few number of people that are making, executive teams and that sort of thing that are making pretty high salaries. And then you have a lot of people at the lower end of the pay scale. So that's going to pull the average up, even though the median is going to be somewhere closer to 41,000. So that's something to note there. That's almost always going to be true whenever you're talking about wages, particularly wages in the private sector. And then you look at where that $48,000 average private sector salary, this is annual. And again, these are just wages, not looking at benefits here, just wages. And both state employees and teachers are making right around that $60,000 mark on average. So basically what that means is that on average, a state employee or a teacher in Vermont is making $12,000 more per year in wages alone. So again, not looking at benefits, just talking about wages and salaries, $12,000 more per year on average.
How does the summer off approach weigh in on the 60,000 for teachers? So I think somebody would probably ask us that.
Yeah, so that is a good question because it's not factored into this at all. I don't necessarily have numbers on how much vacation time on average someone in the private sector gets, but I can guarantee you it's not 12 weeks a year.
Right.
And we'll get into that a little bit later when we start looking at like hourly salaries and how some of those compare. So that's another thing to keep in mind here is that teachers, yes, are sort of on par with state employees in terms of average wages, but they also get 12 weeks of vacation a year.
Right.
Compared to state employees, I think if you asked for 12 weeks of vacation, Pat, when you were commissioner of DMV, I think they probably would have laughed you out of the building, right?
I probably wouldn't be able to ask it the next day because I'd be out.
Yeah. So that is an important thing that doesn't come through in the numbers, that there is that added benefit of having that vacation time as well. So where this gets really interesting is, and this is where that narrative really starts breaking down when that narrative of, and I know you heard this, Pat, when you were, commissioner of labor and you were, and all of that, like you heard this all the time, that our wages are not competitive, so we need to offer really generous benefits.
And I believed it because nobody challenged it. It was just something you believed. That was it.
Yeah, because we've all heard those stories of the teacher up in the Northeast Kingdom that's making $40,000 a year and can't pay the heat bill, right?
Right.
But the reality is that the average teacher makes $60,000 a year, has 12 weeks of vacation. That's way more than anyone in the private sector, most people in the private sector get for wages or benefits. And what's really interesting is we compare that to the top income earners in the state. So we looked at the top 25% of income earners, which is the 75th percentile. 75th percentile starts at 60,700, right at the average state employee and teacher salary. So that means that a significant number of state employees and teachers are in the top 25% of income earners in the state. Again, before you even look at benefits, just wages alone, they're in the top 25%, which means that they're making more in just salary than 3 out of 4 Vermonters. That is a significant statistic that really counters what that narrative is out there of of state employees and teachers being underpaid. If they're in the top 25% of income earners, just looking at wages, forgetting benefits, those are competitive jobs that are out there in the marketplace that even before benefits are considered. So we were surprised by this. It's like, wow, okay. So that narrative must have been true at some point, right?
Yep.
That narrative, like you said, Pat, of, we need to, our state employees and teachers are underpaid, must have been true at some point in the past. So we went looking, and we looked all the way back to 1990, which is 30 years, ago. That's the farthest back that the Department of Labor or the Bureau of Labor Statistics posts publicly available data on wages and benefits. And at no point in that 30-year period were wages in the private sector higher than in the public sector.
Interesting.
And not only at no point were they higher, it actually is interesting within the last decade, about decade and a half. Not only are private sector wages higher, or excuse me, public sector wages higher than the private sector, but they're also growing faster. And this is particularly true when you look at times of recession. So like 2008, for example, you can see, state employees, 2007, 2008 had a much higher wage increase than the private sector. The private sector flattened out, and the public sector flattened out a little bit as well, but then started growing again in 2012 and has grown faster than the private sector. So that's also a counterintuitive narrative of like, not only are the wages higher, and they've always been higher, they're also growing faster. So that is interesting to note. The only caveat to this is that teachers' salaries have started to moderate over the last 8 to 10 years. Largely, that's probably because of school consolidations, shrinking student populations, and budgetary constraints. So there's external factors that are probably impacting teachers' salaries. They're just not increasing as fast. Demand for teaching is not as high as it is in other sectors. So there's probably some market forces at play there that are, some of the demographics of the state are forcing teacher salaries down. And again, Vermont has the lowest student-teacher ratio in the country. So wages are probably not growing as fast because of in response to that sort of demographic shift. So there is some stuff going on there with teachers. And actually, 2008 to 2009 was the first time in the data that we've seen in the last 2 decades where state employees actually passed teachers in terms of average salary. So there are some shifts happening there.
Yeah, I think over the years, Ben, that there are some pockets within state government that have we've had some issues with being competitive. One was nurses, and I can't remember how many years ago that we hired some people to come in and look at the salaries, and they applied market factor adjustments to salaries because we couldn't find, well, it's like now you can't find nurses to come in. And the other one was IT people that we weren't able to hire folks with the backgrounds that we needed in state government. And again, the salaries went up, and I'm not sure that we applied market factor. I think we just adjusted the salaries, but those are pockets of people based on the demand in the marketplace.
And you're always going to find examples of that, right?
Yeah.
Certain occupations where demand is up and you're not competitive with your salaries. Like private companies have this problem all the time, right?
Sure.
There's a shortage, and they're having it right now with nurses, which is an interesting one to bring it up. There is a shortage of nurses, both nationwide as well as here in Vermont, in New England in particular. There is way more demand for nurses than there are trained people. So, so that is forcing nurse salaries up, at least over the last 5 or 6 years. Again, an outside market force that's kind of pushing that. And you have to be responsive to those sorts of things, to make sure that you're competitive. But what we're looking at is overall.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Overall, what is the story? And the overall story is that state employees in particular are very competitive on wages, and when you factor in benefits, it's no competition at all. Because your benefits packages, as we kind of saw back in the first slide, 2-3 times what you're getting in the private sector.
Yep.
So on that same thought, we're like, okay, well, state employees, there's a pretty good distribution with state employees of, you have skilled labor, unskilled labor, college educated, non-college educated, advanced degrees, whatever. That's fairly representative of what you see in the private sector. Pretty even distribution in, for state employees. Fairly similar to what we see in the private sector. But for teachers, it's sort of a different story. Teachers oftentimes have master's degrees or other advanced degrees. They have specialized training. They have certifications, all of that sort of stuff. So is it really fair to compare teachers to the average public employee? And the answer is probably not. So we tried to compare teachers to like occupations. And one of the ones that we compared it to was nursing, for the same reason. Nurses are professional certified. They often have advanced degrees, special trainings, special certifications, very similar in terms of what is required of them from an occupational perspective as teachers. And then we also tried to compare private school teachers to public school teachers, because all the numbers we've looked at so far, we're looking at just public school teachers, right? That $60,000 average, that's just public school. So when we compare these on an hourly basis, so we're looking at, we're trying to look at trends. So looking at 2004 data as well as 2019 data. And what we found is that across the board, actually, the benefits have grown quite a bit. You'll see like 100% growth in benefits for both nurses and for teachers, both public and private, have nearly doubled in that 15-year 15-year time frame. So both groups have seen dramatic increases on the benefit side of the equation, which is going to be this top part of the stacked bar chart here. And wages have also grown between 2004 to 2019, not surprising. But base salaries for public school teachers is still $7 an hour more than nurses are making. So that trend has continued. Looking back at the 2004 comparison, they were higher then, they're still higher, although nurses have caught up a little bit, whereas the wage growth for teachers has slowed down slightly, but they've still maintained that advantage in terms of wages, hourly wages. And they've also maintained a benefits advantage. Actually, they've grown the benefits advantage slightly. They had a 30-cent per hour advantage in their benefits, and they've actually grown that advantage to almost $3 an hour in benefits over what nurses are getting. So that's interesting. So even against what I would say is that even a more competitive workforce market to be in, which is nursing, which is a huge demand right now. Teachers are still out competing both on wages and on benefits. They're out competing nursing, and they're also out competing other teachers in the private sector. And how we know that? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics does not report private teacher compensation separately. They report public school teachers, and then they report all teachers as two separate numbers. So the difference between these two numbers are what basically account for the disparity between what public school teachers are paid and what private school teachers are paid. So this is a good comparison simply because private school teachers are required to have all the same training and all the same certifications as a public school teacher. They just don't have access to the pension plans, and they don't have access to the union negotiating power that a public school teacher has. So this is a good comparison, and what we see is that private school teachers actually draw the average down. So they draw the average hourly wage down by $2 an hour, and they drive the benefits hourly wage down by $3 an hour. And this is for, you look at how many teachers we have in the state, public school teachers compared to private school teachers, private school teachers is a pretty small number compared to compared to the public school teachers. So the fact that they're driving this average down at all is kind of surprising and speaks to the fact that there is a disparity here, that public school teachers are definitely getting paid more than private school teachers are.
Yeah.
So and that's true for wages, and it's very true for benefits. So so comparing these to these occupations, it's pretty clear that, you know, even as much as we would like to pay our teachers more, and they may be, you know, fairly average on a national basis, they're very competitive when you look at similar occupations in Vermont, in the state.
Yeah.
So basically, to kind of recap where we are right now, because we're sort of running out of time here, the average public sector employee, you know, state employee or teacher, is in the top 25% of income earners, and that's before you consider benefits. They also make $12,000 more per year than a private sector employee can expect to make on average. And teachers are paid on par with the national average, despite having the lowest student-teacher ratio in the country. And wages for public sector employees have consistently grown faster over the past 2 decades than they have in the private sector. More consistent wage growth and faster wage growth. So those are all really important points. We are going to look really quickly at how some of these benefits stack up. That's not really the focus of what we're trying to get across, but that is an important piece of understanding just how generous these benefits are. So when we start looking at these pension benefits, compared to what someone in the private sector can expect to earn in retirement. So the average Social Security payout for this year, 2021, in January was $18,500 for Social Security retirement. That is annualized $18,500 a year. If we step up to using the Social Security calculator to someone who retires with an income of $70,000, they're 65 and retire with an income of $70,000, they would make close to their Social Security retirement benefit would be closer to $20,000 a year. And then if we look at the average savings, private savings, so like think 401k or something like that, of someone who's in the private sector, those retirement savings would generate about $22,000 a year in income in retirement, assuming an average life expectancy. So that's what they could expect to pull from their retirement savings on an annual basis, about $22,000 a year, which leaves us with about $42,000 a year in post-retirement income for someone that retired with a salary of $70,000.
Mm-hmm.
Compare that to a state employee, and this data is right from a presentation that the Department of Human Resources put out earlier this summer, where the majority of state employees who are eligible for retirement are eligible at the maximum allowed amount, which is half of their retirement income. And the average person in that group, the average income in that group is $80,400 a year. So we took that group from the DHR presentation and calculated what their retirement benefits would be, what their retirement income would be based on their pension benefit, and then in addition to their Social Security benefit, because they qualify for both. And their Social Security benefit would be $22,500 a year, and then their pension benefit would be $40,200 a year, which gives them a post-retirement income of about $63,000 with a retirement salary of $80,400. So right there you can see, and that again does not include, the other caveat to this is does not include health benefits, because very few private employers provide post-employment health benefits, whereas that's a standard feature of state employees' retirement plan. Right. That's a huge benefit. Benefit. The fact healthcare is the #1 expense for retirees. So having that taken off the table is a huge benefit to people who are retired state employees. Yep. And the other thing I will note here is that this $70,000, retirement wage assumption is probably high. We assumed it was high. We had to pick a number to kind of compare here, but this is probably an optimistic number, and I'll show you why here in a second. So keep in mind that in this scenario, this person is getting more than half of their income from private retirement savings. So a little more than half is coming from their private retirement savings than from Social Security. But if we see on average, actually 62% of all retirees rely on Social Security for half or more of 50% or more of their retirement income. So that person in our example is actually probably in this group right here, the 25 to 45% group. But the majority of people actually rely on Social Security for more than half of their retirement income, and a quarter rely on it for 100% of their retirement income.
Oof.
So that means a quarter of people who are retired are living off of this. Quarter of retirees are living off of this alone. They have no private retirement savings income, which is kind of scary, and really, again, emphasizes the difference between the experience of the average private sector worker in retirement compared to the average public sector worker. And there's really no comparison.
Right.
So this is kind of looking at that slide that we talked about earlier, where you see this is the majority of people who are retirement eligible currently are eligible at the maximum benefit, and their average salary is $80,400. This is right from that DHR presentation that earlier this summer. But what's really concerning in these numbers is that there's a bubble. 10% of employees, current state employees, could retire today and retire at the maximum benefit, and another 9% are going to be eligible within 5 years. So there's another group of these people that are going to be eligible to retire within the next few years here. And we're talking, this has the potential to have huge impact on our state pension plans. So this is really not a problem. The point here is that this is not a problem that's going away anytime soon, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And we need to start being realistic about what this is going to look like, because these plans are at risk of becoming unstable. And if a plan becomes unstable, then we do risk breaking promises to people who are retired, and that's unacceptable. So we really need to do what we can today to try to stabilize these plans and make sure that they are going to be viable long term. So some of the takeaways here that we want to leave you with are, compensation for teachers and state employees, just looking at wages alone, surpasses the private sector, and when you factor in benefits, it far surpasses the private sector. So that notion of public sector employees not being able to compete is really kind of a misnomer. And also, average private employees receive about $20,000 less in retirement income and have no health benefits, like we said. So that's, there's really no comparison on the benefit side of it, particularly when you look at retirement benefits. And then, and as a result, these really high benefit plans, really generous benefit plans, may not be necessary to compete with the private sector. That's really what we're getting at here. We're not saying we need to get rid of these plans, but we're saying that they may not need to be as generous as they are to compete, because our wages are already competitive. When you look at what the average experience is for a public versus a private sector employee. So we need to our policymakers really need to look at this critically and understand where we go from here. That's really kind of the point that I think we're making. So
yeah, I think in this report, we made a couple of recommendations. Could you talk a little bit about those? Certainly not specific recommendations, but just general approach.
Yeah, so our general approach again is everyone needs to share in this. We can't put this solely on teachers. We can't put this solely on state employees. We can't put this solely on taxpayers. Everyone needs to share in the solution. What we're simply saying is that this notion, this argument that's been used to say that we need really generous benefit plans to compete with the private sector for employment and for retention really doesn't hold up when you look at the data. And so we need to understand that. Our policymakers need to understand that. We don't need to be afraid of looking at benefits, changing benefits, particularly for entry-level employees, like new employees coming in. We don't need to be afraid to touch that because our wages are competitive and our benefits packages are very competitive. So we can dial that back a little bit and still be very.
And that's when you should, if we're going to make any dramatic change, it should be done with new hires because they come on board, you explain to them
here's the deal,
what the package, and they agree to it. Because I know over the years they've talked about defined contribution plans or some kind of hybrid, and that never went over well here in Vermont. But for new hires, might be something to consider.
Yeah, and I don't think we're even saying necessarily we need to go to a defined benefit plan or defined contribution plan or whatever. I think we're saying we don't need to be afraid to make changes is really all we're saying. Don't be afraid. Don't let fear get in the way of making the right decisions to safeguard these plans, to make sure that they are going to be viable in 5 years and 10 years and 25 years,
Because I think you said we cannot break our promises. We certainly shouldn't. And we can't put ourselves in a position where that becomes a reality. And
right. We don't want to put ourselves in a position where we have no choice. Right. That sets everyone up for failure. So doing it now and ripping off the Band-Aid now prevents the wound from getting infected.
Excellent. Well, Ben, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be hearing about this a lot over the next, at least we hope so, with all the work that's been put into this. We hope they'll listen and use this information to make our plan stronger and more sustainable. So thank you very much. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.